Oh, I'm a firm believer in that myself. And what did you find to do with yourself while he was painting his tree?
Well, I sat with him and I sketched a little. I don't do it very well, though.
Oh, you're going sketching this afternoon?
Yes.
Where?
Oh, I haven't made up my mind.
I'll drive you somewhere in the car.
Oh, no, please, I didn't mean...
Oh, nonsense. Finish up that mess and we'll get along.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Sven Carlsson, who is a journalist and a co-author of the Spotify play. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks so much.
So let's first start with a little bit about your background. Tell us a little bit in terms of what you've done and eventually how you came to writing this book about Spotify.
Sure. So I grew up in Sweden, but also in a few other countries, moving around as a kid and as a student. I spent time in Russia, in the UK, in the US eventually to get my master's in journalism. And then shortly after that, I began to report on sort of business and economics back in Stockholm, spent time at a few different papers. And while doing that, I began to cover tech, perhaps mainly because it was sort of a shortcut for me in terms of being in a newsroom where tech was a new thing, where a lot of new Swedish startups were making, amazing progress internationally, and no one had really sort of covered them in depth. And I had a shortcut to it because I knew that world, because I grew up with those kinds of consumer services that they were selling. And so I began to dive into it. And obviously the crown jewel in that space was Spotify, being the sort of, after Skype and a few other famous companies, being really the foremost Swedish tech startup at the time. This was around 2015, so a good 8 or 9 years after they had actually launched. And so I began to cover them and continued to do so until they listed on Wall Street in 2018, and then Jonas Leijonhufvud and I began to write the book.
Amazing. Now, did you end up in the process developing a working relationship with some of the co-founders of Spotify?
So Jonas and I have both interviewed Daniel and Martin over the years. We did not get any sort of sit downs with them on the record for the book. I think there were many reasons for that. But we had we'd followed them for a long time, but we did not get any on the record participation. So we had to sort of build the story from our sources and from many on the record, but also off the record interviews with not just, people who'd been in and around Spotify over the years, but also from competitors and from the music industry, from the venture capital world, etc. So we built on a lot of different sources, I think over 80 sort of in-depth interviews done for the book to tell the story. But no, we actually weren't able to sit down with Daniel Ek or Martin Lawrenson, although we did try to tell their story as best we could.
And after the book came out, was there some sort of a kind of a public statement from Spotify in terms of testing to the validity of certain aspects, or did they give comments, or what was their response, if at all?
Not really. No official comment. We heard that they obviously sort of paid attention to the book's release, and we heard that there were some copies floating around the Stockholm headquarters. So clearly, it wasn't banished from Spotify property, but. No official comment, though we did note that they're a bit more outspoken these days about their story. And I believe that some of those aspects, such as their sort of the big TV sort of streaming video project that they had that they never launched, and a few other aspects that were first to report on, they're a bit more open about today. So it's sort of the books brought certain aspects of their history into the public domain that I think they're a bit more comfortable acknowledging these days. And of course, we see that Spotify themselves have begun to tell their story a bit more openly, and they've recently actually launched their own podcast series chronicling the history of Spotify, which bears resemblance to our book, although there's a few differences too.
Mm-hmm. So as a journalist, I mean, you were covering Spotify before you decided to embark on a book, but I wonder if you could kind of give us a little bit of glimpse into your thought process around, what were you thinking about Spotify, aside from the fact that they were kind of this large behemoth that originated from Sweden, but there must have been certain sets of either assumptions or certain kind of thesis that you had and you want to explore. And I wonder, as good journalists, how you were able to outline some of those theses or postulates and then be able to actually find the evidence to either support it or debunk it.
Sure. So there's a number of examples. I'll just try and pinpoint a few. I think that one of the things that we thought about a lot was the fact that there was a lot of drama and a lot of high stakes in the Spotify story that weren't necessarily portrayed, being reported in the press at the time. So we didn't really have, there was an image of Spotify as a very successful Swedish startup that had made it, was beginning to make it big in the US, but there wasn't really a nuanced understanding of what they had gone through to get there. So one thing that we were able to sort of report out was the fact that there were a lot of pivots in the Spotify story. I mean, there were a lot of, this company is a bit of a shapeshifter, really. They'd gone through so many phases, from in the early days emphasizing speed and technology and really building the sort of technically most consumer-friendly product out there, to sort of rapid commercialization, where they had to make a lot of concessions to telecoms operators, but also record labels, of course, throughout the process, and then finding their niche within streaming and positioning themselves in the market. And that really took quite a long time. And I would say that it wasn't until 2014, 15, 16, around that sort of time, that Spotify were able to find a pitch to investors and find a business model that would eventually take them to Wall Street. So there's a lot of phases of Spotify in which they've emphasized lots of different aspects of the service. They were once an app platform, like Facebook once was in 2011, where they saw themselves as a platform on which other apps could innovate. So they would invite other brands, media companies, all types of other services onto their platform. That was a very short-lived idea, but it was just one of the many pitches that Spotify had to the market that actually didn't end up making a lot of progress. It was far from a success, but it was just one of those phases that Spotify went through. And I think another sort of thesis that we built up during our research for the book was we heard these rumors about how Apple, and in particular Steve Jobs, had tried to make life difficult for the Spotify founders ahead of them entering the US market in 2011. And so that was something that really sort of perked our interest, of course, as journalists. And it was something we set out to find out as much as we could about. And so we ended up being able to establish through many sources that Apple certainly was an obstacle, and still has in certain ways is still an obstacle. We hear, daily reports about how these two companies are fighting it out these days in the podcasting space. But this was in 2010, 2011, and Steve Jobs didn't really want a sort of market-leading streaming service entering what he saw as his domain, which was the US market, with a business model in streaming that really sort of went against what he had been trying to propagate with iTunes, which was, of course, downloads. And so Steve Jobs was, he made calls to record company heads and other, influential people in the industry saying, why would you let that, free music service into our country, essentially, was his message. And so those are the types of things that we sort of picked up on and tried to really report out and see what we could sort of establish and write about in the book.
All right, so I think this is a really terrific segue. And I think most of those that are listening right now, of course, have heard or are actively using Spotify. But I wonder if you could take us back to kind of the genesis around the competitive landscape. And again, recognizing that Spotify has gone through many iterations of pivots, but talk about kind of the baseline, not only from just, the competitor landscape, but to your point, what was the monetization model at that point in terms of things like downloads relative to streaming? And what do you think was that ultimate kind of, a tipping point that allowed for things to, be primarily streaming at this point? You may also like our quarterly Ask Your Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit askyourperkins.com/events.
Sure. So, I mean, when Daniel Ek began, this was very much an era. This was the mid-aughts, so 2005, 6, 7. The prevailing idea was that popular and global internet services should be free. That was sort of the school of thought of the day. And Daniel Ek, a child of the 1990s and of the Napster era, was very much with that thought. And so he figured that there would be a way to, funding this through ads, bring music to a global audience and to be able to monetize it and let artists get paid through ads, only through ads. And that was the whole idea. And at one point, he's himself attested to Googling this and finding sort of, a few answers that said that maybe music licenses would cost you about 5% of your revenue per year. And that, of course, was far from the truth. Spotify has, over 70% of its revenue goes to the rights holders today before they can even start to pay for their own operations. So, that was one of the hard lessons he learned. But at this time, the predominant model was downloads through iTunes. And there had been, of course, streaming ventures before. Rhapsody was an early pioneer in this area in the US. And there continued to be other types of streaming services and tons of competitors that came for Spotify too. But I think what they were able to show was that through scaling with a revenue sharing model that they sort of pioneered with the record labels, they were able to build, to scale to such a point that the record labels began to see significant income. Now, that took a number of years for them to see any sort of important sort of revenue levels coming from streaming. But what they had in the meantime was large advance payments. And so Spotify, I mean, they really, they basically paid their way into the US market. They had to, Daniel and Martin, the co-founders, had to offer up their own shareholdings to Universal in case they didn't, if Spotify had sold, Universal would have been liable to sell their shares or to offer their shares to Universal for up to a certain point. And they had to also offer a large options package to Sony Music. And so there was a lot of dealing with the music industries to simply pay their way into the door until Spotify could show the sort of volumes that by 2014 had amounted to around $2 billion worth of licensing payments that had gone to the industry. And so, there's just a lot of sort of music industry deal making that paved the way for this company. And I think essentially once streaming proved that significant revenue could be generated around 2015, 16, that was when we had seen that the streaming model had won. And of course, that was around the time that Apple, Spotify's largest rival, launched Apple Music, which of course was in part a concession to Spotify to say that, streaming is, we recognize this model as being the future. And I think that, Apple Music is where Apple is investing in terms of music these days. And it's not about MP3 downloads anymore.
Yeah, one quick comment and then a follow-up question. One is, taking a kind of a parallel analogy to, let's say, videos and movies. Over the last decade or so, we've seen the evolutions of many different types of models, business models and monetization models. And it's interesting to see how are starting to see that subscriptions like the Netflix are starting to go down to some extent as people are canceling, perhaps because it's just, they're fatigued by it. and you're seeing the rise of free streaming platforms like Tubi and others, where people are essentially watching ads to get content. So in some ways, I think in the music area as well, there's been a lot of innovation, but it's interesting how we've, in effect, in this kind of 2020s, reverted back to almost like a radio advertising model to a great extent. So that's a quick comment. In terms of the question is, again, going back to the competitive landscape, there's a lot of different players with slightly different models. What was it that at some point Spotify just became a bigger brand, and what really attributed to that versus, let's say, again, different models, but the Pandoras and the Apples and other players?
I think the one competitive advantage that Spotify has been able to hold on to has been their freemium model and the free tier of their service, essentially. So they've always maintained a version of their service that is free to the user. And that's been quite controversial. Warner Music, for instance, were quite insistent that the free tier of their service would not make it into the US market in 2010, which we report on. But it's been enormously effective in terms of growing Spotify's user base. And of course, their whole business has become recruiting large numbers of users, but also converting them into paid. And their conversion work has picked up. It's gotten better and better since 2013 or so. And now, in fact, we're in a place where they're actually focusing more on advertising revenue than they have been in the past few years, partly through podcasting. So it's quite interesting what you say, that Spotify is not just about premium subscriber revenue anymore. They're trying to sort of shift the balance there a little bit as far as they can. But I think that really Spotify's free tier has been their unique selling point all along, and it continues to be. And it's especially important now that Spotify is looking for growth in other markets. They've recently launched in a number of African and Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian markets. And I think that you'll see that the free tier is really going to be the key to their growth in those areas. And then for them to pay sustainable rates to rights holders so that the business survives, it's incumbent upon them to convert those new users into paid. And that's sort of what they've become experts at doing over the past few years.
Now, you mentioned something earlier that I think is really interesting, and I think in many ways kind of challenges, I think, the capital markets and the startup ecosystem, which is this notion of Spotify, like many others, had to pay their way into play the game or enter the US market. And certainly, it's not surprising that there was a pushback in terms of a freemium model. So somebody has to be paying for the freemium model. Somebody has to be paying for the ability to actually pay to play in the US. So talk about that model in terms of the venture capital and the capital markets, and who's effectively subsidizing this thing. Now, in the case of Spotify, they've, of course, done very well. But in the case of Theranos or others where they've, gone to a certain size, but then at some point kind of imploded. And who bears the cost of, this type of scaling and initial, ownership of CapEx?
Well, actually, it's built into the Spotify model that they sort of pay for the model themselves. If the free tier, if their share of free users becomes higher, then that becomes, in certain conditions, that becomes a financial burden to Spotify. So at times, launching in new markets can be quite costly for them, because recruiting a lot of new free users increases their royalty payments, because they need a certain balance of premium subscribers. And it's a very it's a pretty complex deal with the rights holders in each market. And so it's sort of built into the model that Spotify can't, they need to maintain a fairly high ratio of premium subscribers, which will of course generate them more money, but also let them keep more of their income in terms of how their deals with the record labels are structured. And so essentially, while Spotify has had to grow at a very rapid pace all along, it's also been costly for them to do that. And so one example of that is when they were able to negotiate a free tier on mobile devices, which was something Spotify hadn't had previously. Remember, they were launched in the desktop era. So Spotify sort of had to transition. They weren't like Uber, who were born in the mobile era. Spotify had to transition into the mobile era and also negotiate the licenses to get not just a premium app, which paid users were always able to use Spotify on mobile, but they had to negotiate with the rights holders to get licenses for a free mobile app. And once they got them, and this is a sort of a near-death experience for the company, as Daniel Ek tells it. Once they got them, their growth really shot up, but so did their costs. And so financially, while the growth was great for the company because it meant, a lot of opportunities to reach new users and to hopefully convert them into subscribers, it was financially quite hazardous for the company to be growing that quickly on the free side. And so it's this really delicate balance built into the business model. And I think that, the one thing that the record labels and publishers have really made sure of from day one is to ensure what they see is a healthy balance between the free users and paying subscribers.
So you just referenced a near-death experience in terms of managing the hyper-growth with the cost associated with that freemium type of a model. In those early days of hyper-growth, but prior to really starting to turn over to a cash flow positive, who were the prominent kind of VCs that were supporting it, and what's the level of capitalization that they've gone through to get to a point where they are today? Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Julianne Hough, actress, dancer, and winner of Dancing with the Stars; Damian Vaughn, former NFL player; Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
So Spotify were lucky in that they had a co-founder who had previously had a successful exit from an ad tech company called Trade Doubler here in Stockholm that Martin Lorentzen listed and was able to make around $50 million from. And a significant part of that money funded Spotify in the early years. And so that's what made them able to sort of have really high ambitions, even though they hadn't actually attracted outside funding yet. They had a rich co-founder who was able to bankroll their operations essentially for the first around 2 years. And then they got some local, they were always pitching to outside investors from the UK and from the US, but there was a lot of skepticism towards any sort of streaming music models because nobody had really done it before. So eventually they were able to convince some local VCs, Northzone and Creandum, who are more famous now than they were then because of their Spotify investment. And then eventually with the B round and the C round, they got more sort of international established VC players on board, such as Excel, Kleiner Perkins also. DST Global was a very important backer. And around the same time, DST, which is run by Russian billionaire Yuri Milner, also invested in Facebook at a higher valuation than the rest of the market was able to stomach around 2009 after the financial crisis. And so Spotify's actually had a few unconventional financiers over the years. The Coca-Cola company at one point participated in a round. They eventually got some capital from, obviously they made a deal with Tencent, the Chinese conglomerate, that enabled them to clear their debts and list on the stock exchange. And they've actually not, because of their funding trajectory has been a bit unconventional because they've sort of they've always had a pretty high valuation, which has left them with actually not a lot of bargaining power at times when striking deals for funding. So it's quite interesting to look at that. But obviously they were able to make it, and cash flow positive. I mean, that didn't happen for Spotify until after they listed on the stock exchange. So it was about 12 years of running the company before they were able to report a profitable quarter. And I believe that Spotify has still not reported a profitable full year. So that's been a long time coming for them.
Really interesting, and you kind of started to inference it around the Sweden Nordic ecosystem. And in the case of Spotify, I think, of course, they were very fortunate to have a co-founder who was in a position to actually subsidize or support or capitalize, I should say, for so many part of the earlier years. But I wonder if you could talk about Sweden as a startup hub and an ecosystem, and how it actually over the years has been even referenced as a unicorn factory, a tech superstar from the north. And of course, we have Spotify, but lesser known, but still nonetheless, well known. Of course, are White Space, Iris, Tink, Life, Sum, to Universal Avenue, and many new ones that are up and coming. And given the fact that you have a home base of the Ericsson, the Volvo, IKEA, and a lot of the engineers that are really coming out of, especially like Ericsson, for example, how is that helping to support this robust startup ecosystem?
Well, sure. I mean, there's a strong sort of engineering tradition in Sweden generally that I think really helped. I mean, Daniel Ek went to, he has described himself as a dropout of KTH, the sort of Stanford of Stockholm. And actually, our reporting shows that he maybe wasn't ever even admitted. We can't really be sure. But regardless, I mean, there is a strong engineering tradition, and that's really what built the company early on. And I think that Spotify has done a whole lot for the Swedish tech ecosystem. I think that around the time that they were raising capital, that wasn't really something that was happening. I mean, this was after the dot-com bubble had burst, 5 or 6 years after, and there wasn't a whole lot of interest for these types of businesses in Sweden. And so they really sort of pioneered the sort of tech VC model here. And now we see that, we've produced a handful of other unicorns since then. And what we can see is that the sort of early employees who spent time at Spotify and maybe went on to other ventures later on were able to sort of invest in their own companies or maybe join other growing startups. And it's so many people that we interview and talk to will say that Spotify is it's really set a high precedent for what can be done here, and that's something that actually Daniel Ek needs to be credited for. From day one, he's always talked about how he has wanted to build a global, sort of world-leading tech company that is European. It's Swedish, but also European, and it's not. He's always said that hopefully. In 2009, he told Kara Swisher, who at that time was working at All Things Digital, that she asked him whether Spotify would be acquired by a Google or a large US company, and he said, well, hopefully we can stay independent and grow and start to acquire US businesses. And as we can see, that's kind of where we are today.
Amazing. Now, can you give a quick perspective around Sweden relative to, let's say, Finland as well as Norway? And how, kind of from a Nordic region, why there are certain concentration of tech hubs or centers, whereas maybe there are some others that are more maybe perhaps lagging?
Sure. I mean, in Sweden, I think there's a number of things going for Stockholm and Sweden, and I would, I'm sitting here in my Stockholm apartment, so this might, not be too credible coming from me, but I do think it's the tech capital of Scandinavia, at least at the moment. And I think there's a number of explanations that people tend to cite, and I think there's, a sort of adaptation to sort of US, just American culture in Sweden. We're quite sort of US facing, which means that people speak English. People are able to work in English speaking companies. They understand maybe the marketing side of things. They understand perhaps programming culture in a different way because of that. The engineering, of course, track record that I mentioned earlier on. And then there's been a number of initiatives, political initiatives from the 90s or 80s and 90s onwards to sort of disseminate, for instance, broadband internet in the mid-1990s, state-subsidized home computers for anyone working in a public business, for instance. That really helped to get a lot of teenagers online around 95. And not just online, but also at different speeds than we were seeing in, for instance, the US. So Daniel Ek was able to download music on Napster at a much higher pace than a lot of other users, I think. And that really sort of helped to encourage a lot of young sort of internet savvy kids and let them, go on and do their own thing. So I think there's a number of factors that sort of explain Sweden's success. And in terms of music, I mean, Sweden was also the sort of hotbed for piracy around the time that Spotify launched. So that, that I think for Daniel Ek, for the Spotify CEO, I think that showed him how the power in user-friendly music solutions. But it also convinced him that in order to build a commercially viable service, you needed to compete not with record stores, but with the pirating, the piracy side of things, with the pirated services. And so it had to be user-friendly enough for people to be willing to spend time looking on ads or even pay a little bit to listen to the music. And so I think that really inspired him to build his company.
Terrific insight. So with that, I've been joined by Sven Carlsson, who is a journalist and one of the co-authors of the Spotify Play. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks so much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.